Steve turned around, took one last look at the orphanage, and then walked away down the alley that led to the city. Steve was brought up in an orphanage from the age of 3. He hardly remembered his mother, and he didn't know his father at all. But now he had to return to his home, where he had not been for more than 15 years. Housing was provided for other graduates. There were small apartments in different parts of the city, but Steve had a house, according to the documents, which he inherited from his mother and grandmother. Now he had to go back there and live in the countryside. The guy was in a bad mood. The village must have been deserted by now, and he had no idea what to do there. The road took a long time. Steve was hungry and very tired, so he got to the place and looked into the local store to buy himself some food. He was surprised because a pretty girl was standing behind the counter. Steve smiled at her. "Hi, what's your name?" The black-eyed beauty chuckled. "Did you come to the store for this?" "Of course not. Although I'm a young single guy. Maybe I'm your destiny." The girl laughed. "If you're my destiny, then some unsightly." At that moment, the door of the store opened and grandmother appeared on the threshold.
"Dolores, who are you talking to?"
"With a buyer." Grandma looked at Steve.
"I don't remember such a guy in our village. Who are you?"
"My name is Steve. I was born in this village. My grandmother and mother lived here. Maybe you know the Maxwells?"
"Yes, how beautiful you grew up. And I'm Mrs. Page, your neighbor, and this is my granddaughter Dolores. You always played together when you were children, and you were called bride and groom."
She laughed and turned to Dolores.
"I told you about it."
The embarrassed girl exclaimed, "Granny, that's enough."
"Don't swear. It's better to give me flour and butter. I'll bake a pie. I need to treat Steve with something."
Steve was embarrassed now, as he wasn't used to being kindly treated by strangers. "Mrs. Page, why? I'll buy myself some food so I won't go hungry. I'm embarrassed in front of you." Grandmother exclaimed,
"No, boy. Everything here is simple. If you want to live here, then get used to it."
The young man smiled, then bought what he needed. He waited for Mrs. Page to also buy groceries, then took her bags from her and offered to walk her home. The old lady said,
"Let's go, Steve. Let's go."
She then nodded to her granddaughter.
"You don't need to linger here either."
On the way to the house, Steve and Mrs. Page got into a conversation. He told her how he was brought up in an orphanage. Mrs. Page shook her head for a long time and then began to answer Steve's questions.
"Your mother Maria was unhappy. Elizabeth suppressed her since childhood, and I told her to leave the girl alone. Maybe now she would live. She didn't let your father Robert and Maria live together, so he left her. When they became to live together, they were very young. They were 18 years old. They lived together for a little while, maybe a month, maybe 2 months, and then Robert went into the army. He didn't come back from there. Elizabeth told him to find himself another woman. Here's such a life."
Steve wanted to ask something else, but at this time they approached the grandmother's house. The guy said goodbye to his neighbor and went to his room. The unkempt and neglected house brought melancholy and despondency to him. Steve wandered around the rooms, took a broom standing in the corner and removed the cobwebs in the doorway. Then he wiped the chair with a rag and sat down. He said sadly, "Here I'm at home, but everything here is very bleak." The guy sat a little longer and went to look at the sheds. Desolation was everywhere. The grass in some places hit the guy with his head, and he hurried back in the house. Steve tried to remember his childhood but couldn't. Suddenly, he really wanted to cry uncontrollably as in childhood, because he felt his loneliness more than ever. But he was not used to crying, and he endured all hardships and insults with tightly compressed lips. And now he clenched his will into a fist and began cleaning, deciding to clean up at least one room. Suddenly, a rustle was heard. Steve looked into the corridor and saw a large puppy, which wrapped itself in a pile of some rags and tried to lie down to sleep comfortably. The guy smiled as he picked up the puppy. "Who are you?" The puppy was very emaciated from hunger, despite the fact that he was a large breed. Steve fed the puppy and continued cleaning. He spent several hours cleaning, but the house didn't become cozier. Suddenly, Someone's footsteps were heard on the porch. The guy looked out and saw Dolores. The girl said, "My grandmother is calling you for dinner." Then she blushed and gasped when she saw the puppy. "Where did you get him from? How pretty he is." "He was here, hiding in the hallway. I don't know how he got there. Now he will live with me." The girl smiled and looked him straight in the eyes. Then they went to the next house. Steve enjoyed visiting Mrs. Page and Dolores. They treated him as the closest and dearest person, and he didn't know how to thank them. He only said that they could count on him day and night. And they began to live in a friendly neighborhood. The next morning, Dolores came to Steve's house and helped him clean it up. He didn't even expect that everything would be done so deftly and well. The girl even brought curtains and hung them on the windows. She explained that they had been in their closet for more than a year. After cleaning, Dolores asked Steve to help her stack the wood in the shed. Steve readily agreed, but by the evening, he didn't feel his arms or legs from fatigue. He didn't immediately get used to rural life, but suddenly he realized that he really liked such a life. And he really wanted Dolores to always be there. She also had no parents. First, her father died, and then 5 years ago, her mother died. She had only Mrs. Page, the closest of all relatives, her mom's mom. But the girl didn't lose heart, although she was very sorry that her mother and father had gone to another world so early. She talked a lot about them to Steve, and sometimes it seemed to him that he knew them very well. A couple of months later, Dolores helped the guy get a job. Now, he was a loader in a food warehouse. Of course, for this he had to travel to a neighboring village, but that meant nothing. But Steve was very proud when he received his first salary. He bought Mrs. Page and Dolores the city's gifts and gave them a real party in the evening. He said, "I'll save money and I'll run a farm. I will supply my products to the market." Dolores laughed, knowing how hard it is for Steve to live in the countryside. "Farmer, are your axe blisters healed?" He laughed in response. "From an axe, yes. From a shovel, not yet." And Mrs. Page thought, looking at him, that such a groom would be perfect for her granddaughter. Handsome, not afraid of work, and doesn't drink alcohol like other guys in their village. A year passed. One summer, Steve and Dolores went swimming in the river, accompanied by their faithful dog. They were having fun, and Steve caught Dolores and held her tightly to him. But suddenly, she froze and looked into the guy's eyes. He understood everything and kissed her, obeying some kind of call. The girl gasped, but didn't push the guy away, but answered the kiss. From that day on, Steve and Dolores started talking about the wedding and announced to Mrs. Page that they were going to get married. The grandmother wept with joy at such news and hugged her grandchildren. Steve was tidying up the attic one morning when he found a box full of photos, greeting cards, and odds and ends. There were also several letters written by a certain Robert to Maria. Steve thought about it and suddenly gasped. They were letters from his father to his mother. Robert wrote about his imminent return, about his love for her, and that she would definitely take Maria with him. In subsequent letters, he asked why she was not answering, and finally, he reproached her for not loving him. Robert wrote, "I received a letter from your mother. I know that you are getting married. Have you completely forgotten me?" Steve considered. His mom didn't read any of those letters. She didn't even open them. But why? The guy collected the whole bundle of letters and went to Mrs. Page. Maybe she knows the answer. But she just shook her head and said, "It turns out that your grandmother Elizabeth set everything up. So she separated them. She didn't like her son-in-law. She received letters and hid them. Maybe Robert doesn't know you exist. After all, your mother gave birth to you, and soon she died. Elizabeth followed her away from grief. She realized what she had done. That's why you ended up in an orphanage." Steve turned the envelope over in his hands. "Mrs. Page, there is a return address here. I can find my father. I will definitely find him." And the very next day, he said goodbye to the bride and her grandmother and left to look for his father. He did it quickly, and now he was already standing in front of a tall and handsome man whose copy was himself. "Are you Roberts?" "Yes. Who are you?" "And I'm Steve, your son. Maria gave birth to me. Look, these are your letters to her." Robert took the letters in his hands and then staggered. "Come inside, guy. Tell me everything." The long conversation ended with a strong hug between father and son. Robert said, "I have a different family for a long time, but I won't leave you either. I live well, as you can see, and I will help you get on your feet. I used to be poor, so Elizabeth didn't like me. You will study, get a specialty, and come to work for me at the firm. You will have everything, absolutely everything. We will travel abroad. You will see the world. Do you want this, my son?" Steve replied, "I really want this." "That's good. We'll decide everything. Now, my wife and both daughters are resting in France. Soon we will join them. My wife is a smart woman, so she will understand everything. I think that your sisters will also be glad to meet you. We need to get you an international passport." Steve replied, smiling at his father, "No, Dad, thanks. That's not what I came for. I just wanted you to know about me. You have a right to it. Dolores and Mrs. Page and my dog are waiting for me at home." Robert said, "I won't let you go so quickly. We need to learn more about each other and talk about so much. How stupid I was that I believed your grandmother then. How could I not go to Maria and not talk to her? I won't forgive myself for this." Since then, 2 weeks have passed. Dolores even lost weight from the experience. Steve called her and said that he was staying with his father for a while, that his father was very happy with him and wanted to be with him for a while. The girl looked up at the elderly woman with huge eyes. "Grandma, what if Steve doesn't come back? What will happen then?" But Mrs. Page was silent. She knew well how tempting money was. But one evening, a car stopped at Steve's house. 2 men got out. It was Steve and Robert. Steve said, "So I'm back." And then he hugged the girl who ran out to meet him. And Mrs. Page invited guests for tea. Several years have passed. Steve and Dolores were married and had a daughter. Father helped Steve open his farm, and the young couple was happy and full of hope for a future that was filled only with joy and love for them.